Good afternoon. Well, it's nice to be back home from a visit to far north Queensland, and I got to say, if you were up in the Daintree, staying in the treehouse in the rainforest was a really good experience. Almost no walls and an outdoor showering in warm creek water. It was fantastic if you get a chance to go. Well, I've got to say too, I'm back at Fingal Beach now. It is nice to be able to be on the beach and be able to go for a swim and not have to worry about saltwater crocodiles and stingers. I'm not, even I don't want to wrestle a crocodile. But it's been interesting because, of course, I really do feel like being in Bali at the moment and doing some more yoga training, but being in Australia, we can't travel at the moment. But it was funny, I realised that when I lived in New Zealand, all I ever did was come to Australia on holidays, and when I'm living here, I go back there for holidays. So it's kind of a strange strategy. So it's a very, very big country, and a lot of it I haven't explored. So until the borders open up and we can all start travelling again, it'll be a good chance for me to explore more of this country, particularly up north with some of the national parks up at the very north of this big country. So as usual, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of health things and a couple of cryptocurrency things. In terms of health, I wanted to talk a lot about bacteria, and I wanted to talk about the difference between the Entourage Effect and the concept of a cascading series of biochemical reactions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between decentralization of Bitcoin and a distributed network, and the difference between gold and Bitcoin. So if you're interested in any of that, hang on there, we'll be started in a second. Alright, so let's talk about bacteria. Bacteria were the original life forms on the planet. Probably, we think, scientists say Earth's about 4.5 billion years old. Bacteria, they say, were here about a billion years later, 3.5 billion years. We don't know about viruses. I would think probably longer, but we don't really count them because it's even debated whether they're alive, because they're basically a little tiny piece of DNA or RNA surrounded in a phospholipid membrane. So let's say bacteria were the first life forms 3.5 billion years ago, and then they changed about a billion years later when one giant freaking bacteria went and swallowed a smaller bacteria, and the smaller bacteria lived on inside the bigger bacteria and became known as you got it, mitochondria. From that organism, with this mitochondria, which provided it with a new way of producing energy, more efficient way of producing energy, came all other life forms. It branched off into plants and it branched off to fungi. And we actually came off from the fungi line. Animals came from the fungi line, which is why when you're treating mold illness, it's quite difficult, because we don't have many good antifungal medications that kill fungus but don't kill us, because under a microscope our cells look very similar, and that's why, because we're from the same lineage as fungi. My point about this, I'm getting to it, don't worry. My point about this is that there was research out this week that they have found DNA in bacteria which don't photosynthesize. So we're talking the very, very rudimentary bacteria. Some bacteria learned how to use light to photosynthesize food, but the bacteria that can't photosynthesize, the very basic ones, they have genes in their DNA which work as a circadian clock. So these very basic forms of bacteria, the first life forms on the planet 3.5 billion years ago, have internal clocks to tell them what time of the day it is. My point is, that is how important circadian rhythms, living your life in harmony with them, that's how important it is, because the original life forms on this planet, before we got lungs, before we got hearts, before we got a brain, had genes which controlled the circadian clock. Now, speaking about circadian rhythms, we have just found, just last week, remember 6 months ago we found for the first time that we've got mitochondria free in our blood. We used to think they were all just inside our cells. Now we've found them free in our blood. We don't really know what they do there, but my guess is that that is how our organs communicate with the environment, but also between each other. They'll take signals from the environment to communicate it between organs by having the mitochondria free in the blood. Now we've just found DNA in our cells we used to call junk DNA. Now, a lot of our DNA, it turns out, is viral origin. Over time, with evolution, we have integrated a lot of viral DNA into our genome. Now, that's given us some evolutionary advantages because we have a lot of, quote, spare parts DNA to use to evolve quickly with environmental changes, climatic changes. But for the most part, we've called this junk DNA because we didn't think it had any effect. And what the research showed this week was that junk DNA actually does have an effect, and its effect is with the circadian clock. So once again, we've got this DNA inside us which helps set our time and respond to environmental cues, particularly light, which is where most of our circadian rhythm comes from, as that light interacts. Hello? 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 That light interacts through our retina with the DHA, the omega-3 fatty acid, with our suprachiasmatic nucleus in our brain, which is our central clock for our body, which then all the other clocks, all our organs have their own clocks, but they're set from the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. So now we've found out, just in the last 6 months, we've got mitochondria in our blood which almost certainly communicate with the environment, and next week I'll talk about how we might be able to sense electromagnetic fields with magnetism. So we've got mitochondria free in our blood, and we've got DNA in our cells which we thought used to be junk, but now we know it's involved with, once again, setting the circadian rhythm. Last thing I want to talk about medically was the entourage effect, which I write about a lot. Entourage effect is where plants have multiple different phytonutrients to help them survive. So plants grow in the soil. Soil is full of fungi and parasites and viruses and bacteria. Many of them, we want to consume the plant. We put this little seedling in the soil and it survives, so it needs an immune system. Its immune system is its phytonutrients, but it has multiple of them. It doesn't just have one. It can't just rely on one defense system. It's got multiple. But those defense systems need to work together, not in isolation. So a reductionist approach is to take one of those nutrients out of the plant and use it as a kind of a therapeutic tool. But it's much better if we keep them together, because they work much better together. It's just the same as that big thing in the sky, which also has an entourage effect. Because yes, we get vitamin D from the sun by the action of the UV light, acting on by blood, skin and blood vessels to produce vitamin D from cholesterol. But not only am I getting vitamin D from the sun, I'm also activating T cells. I'm also producing endorphins and serotonin and melatonin, and nitric oxide is being released, so there's an entourage effect with sunlight as well. So that's why we want to try and consume a lot of our nutrients as a whole food source. Now that's the same as when we look at the cause of an illness. I often write about A increasing the risk of B, which is very different to A causing B, because most illnesses are multifactorial in origin. They don't just have one cause. There's a combination of events which have to occur for that to happen. I talk about carrot cakes. I say, because I'm not that smart, I say I say you need more than carrots to make carrot cake, otherwise you just got mashed carrots. Not as good. Other people talk about, well, the smart people talk about a cascading series of biochemical events, which is actually a much more romantic and accurate way of putting it than carrot cake, but there you go. And the way I think about that is a river leading to the ocean. Now, if the ocean is the illness that we get, and we know that 90 to 95% of chronic illness is caused by mitochondrial dysfunction, then the streams which lead into the river are the different causes which lead to that mitochondrial dysfunction. So the art of medicine, the art of health, is working out what are the different streams which lead to the river, which lead to the into the ocean. It's not just about the illness, it's about the different factors which are involved in any illness. Right, so what have we done? We've talked about bacteria, we've talked about the entourage effect, we've talked about circadian rhythms. Let's quickly finish up talking about Bitcoin. I wrote the other day that Bitcoin is decentralized, which is very different to a distributed ledger. Bitcoin is cryptography, which is stored on multiple computers around the world called nodes. And because they're distributed all over the world, it's called a distributed ledger. Now that's very different to decentralized. Decentralized and permissionless means that there's no CEO of Bitcoin. There's no one you can ring up and complain if you make if you make a mistake with Bitcoin. But also there's nobody to ring up and you've got to get approval to use it or buy it or send it. It's permissionless and it's decentralized. No head office that you can go and complain to. It's money for the people, by the people, stored on a distributed ledger. And finally, I was reading a good definition. I think it was Pomp who wrote it on Twitter, who said that gold is the analog version of a monetary system, whereas Bitcoin is the digital version of a monetary system. We want a monetary system which holds its value or goes up in time, rather than a currency which decreases in value over time. And Bitcoin is the digital version of gold, which has provided us with the closest to that for the last 5,000 years. All right, it's been great walking. It's been great talking. Peace and love. Talk to you next week.